Good evening, dear friends. I'm Jake Walker, and this is the newest story on my channel.
Snow swept across the frozen hills outside St. Andrew Church, while former Navy SEAL Jake Mercer repaired the shelter's failing heater before the Colorado blizzard arrived. Inside the quiet building, his retired German Shepherd Shadow suddenly lifted its head toward the side entrance, ears sharp, body rigid, as if the old military dog sensed someone frightened standing alone beyond the storm. Cold wind rolled through the narrow streets of Aspen Ridge, Colorado, carrying the first heavy snow of the season across rooftops, frozen fences, and the dark pine forests surrounding the little mountain town. The old bells of St. Andrew Church swayed softly above the community shelter, while gray clouds buried the sky low enough to make the whole valley feel smaller, quieter, almost forgotten beneath winter. Inside the church maintenance room, Jake Mercer crouched beside a rusted heating unit with a wrench in one hand and a flashlight balanced against his shoulder. The smell of burnt dust and machine oil clung to the air while the old pipes rattled weakly behind the walls. Jake was 39 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the solid frame of a man who had spent most of his life carrying heavy gear through war zones instead of living inside comfortable homes. Years in the Navy SEALs had carved sharp lines into his face. A faded scar crossed the bridge of his nose, and rough stubble darkened his jaw beneath tired gray eyes that always seemed to study rooms before trusting them. His dark brown hair had begun graying near the temples earlier than it should have, mostly from stress and too many sleepless nights after Syria. People around Aspen Ridge respected Jake, but very few truly knew him. He volunteered at the church often, repaired broken fences for elderly neighbors, and rarely spoke longer than necessary. The truth was, silence felt safer to him now. 18 months earlier, during a failed extraction mission near the Syrian border, Jake lost his closest teammate Ryan Walker after arriving less than a minute too late to pull him from a collapsing building. Since then, guilt followed him like another shadow. Some nights he still woke, hearing distant explosions that were no longer there. Beside the doorway rested Shadow, an 8-year-old German shepherd with thick black and tan fur, broad shoulders, and intelligent amber eyes that never stopped watching. A thin scar cut through the fur near his left ear where shrapnel had grazed him during Iraq. Though older now, Shadow still carried the disciplined posture of a military K-9. His ears twitched at every unfamiliar sound while his heavy paws remained planted firmly against the wooden floorboards. Jake trusted the dog more than most people. They had survived too many things together overseas to need words anymore. Pastor Michael Bennett stepped quietly into the room carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. Michael was a tall man in his early 60s, with silver hair combed neatly behind his ears and kind blue eyes softened by years of counseling grieving families, struggling veterans, and lonely widows throughout the county. Unlike many pastors, he rarely preached loudly. He listened more than he spoke, and perhaps that was why people trusted him. "You've been fighting that heater all afternoon," Michael said gently, handing Jake a coffee. "If this storm gets worse, we'll have half the town sleeping in here tonight." Jake took the cup with a faint nod. Then the heater better survive the night. Michael smiled softly before glancing toward Shadow. "Funny thing about that dog, he watches people like he's reading their secrets." Jake looked toward the shepherd. "Most times he probably is." Outside, wind slammed snow against the stained glass windows, hard enough to make the old church groan. Aspen Ridge often disappeared beneath storms like this during winter. The mountain roads became traps of ice, and people learned quickly that survival in Colorado depended as much on neighbors as preparation. Jake returned to tightening bolts inside the heater, while Shadow remained unusually still beside the door. Then suddenly the dog lifted his head. Every muscle beneath his thick fur tightened at once. His ears rose sharply forward while a deep rumble formed low in his chest. Jake noticed immediately. Shadow never reacted without reason. "What is it?" Jake asked quietly. The shepherd stood before Jake, even reached the doorway. Snow blasted through the hall the moment Jake opened the side entrance. Wind howled across the church steps in violent waves, covering the parking lot in white. At first he saw nothing except snow. Then two figures slowly emerged from the storm. An elderly man struggled up the icy stairs while holding another man against his shoulder to keep him standing. Both looked nearly frozen. Jake moved instantly. "Easy now," he called, stepping into the wind. The older man lifted tired eyes toward him. Arthur Bennett looked close to 80, thin beneath a soaked brown winter coat that hung loosely over his frail body. Deep wrinkles lined his pale face and his white hair curled damply beneath an old wool cap. Yet despite his age, there remained stubborn pride in him, the kind carried by men who once learned to survive terrible things without asking anyone for help. His hands trembled badly from cold as he tried holding up the second man. Frank Doyle coughed violently beside him, barely able to breathe. Frank was shorter and heavier than Arthur, though sickness had hollowed much of the strength from him now. His thinning gray beard carried flecks of snow while his skin had turned pale from fever. Every breath sounded wet and painful deep in his chest. "Please," Arthur said through chattering teeth. "We don't want trouble. Just somewhere warm for him to sit a while." Jake immediately grabbed Frank beneath one arm while Pastor Michael hurried forward from the hallway. Together they brought both men inside as snow melted across the church floor. Shadow approached slowly, unusually quiet now. The German shepherd stopped directly beside Arthur and studied him carefully, nose twitching against the cold air surrounding the old veteran. Arthur froze slightly when the dog moved closer, not from fear exactly, but from the reflex of someone unused to feeling safe around anything stronger than himself. "You're all right," Jake said calmly. Arthur nodded once, though his eyes remained fixed toward the church doors as if expecting someone else to appear behind them. Pastor Michael guided Frank toward a chair near the heater, while Jake handed Arthur a dry blanket. "You boys can't stay outside tonight," Michael said. "Roads are nearly gone already." Arthur lowered his eyes. "The woodshed out back is enough. We don't need charity." Jake studied him carefully. Even exhausted, Arthur still spoke like a soldier trying to preserve dignity. Men from older wars often carried pride like armor long after their bodies failed them. Frank suddenly coughed harder, nearly collapsing forward. Shadow immediately stood beside him, watching with alert concern. "He needs warmth now," Jake said firmly. Arthur hesitated several seconds before finally whispering, "Thank you." The words sounded difficult for him, like gratitude had become unfamiliar over time. Jake helped Frank toward one of the shelter rooms while Arthur followed slowly behind. Something about the old man unsettled him, though he couldn't explain why yet. Not danger, fear. The kind that settles deep into someone after months or years of living carefully. Shadow remained glued to Arthur's side the entire walk down the hallway. Near the shelter room, Arthur finally removed his soaked gloves with shaking fingers. For half a second, his coat sleeve slid upward beneath the church lights. Jake froze. Dark bruises circled the old man's wrist, finger-shaped. Old marks layered beside newer ones. Arthur quickly pulled the sleeve back down, but not before Shadow saw them too. The German shepherd immediately stepped in front of Arthur, body rigid now, ears forward, a low warning growl rumbling deep inside his chest toward the dark snowstorm still moving beyond the church doors. The storm deepened over Aspen Ridge through the following evening, burying the roads beneath thick sheets of snow while freezing wind moaned through the pine trees surrounding St. Andrew Church. The town looked softer from a distance beneath the snowfall, almost peaceful. But inside the shelter, the air carried another kind of tension entirely. Jake Mercer noticed it the moment Arthur Bennett stepped into any room. The old veteran always searched for exits first, always checked windows, always flinched when headlights passed outside. Fear had become part of his nervous system now, stitched so deeply into his instincts that even warmth could not convince his body it was safe. Inside the shelter kitchen, yellow lights glowed softly over folding tables lined with canned soup, donated blankets, and old winter coats gathered by church volunteers before the storm. Frank Doyle sat wrapped in 2 heavy blankets near the heater, while steam rose from a cup of tea trembling between his weathered hands. His cough sounded slightly better after resting overnight, though every breath still rattled painfully in his chest. Frank had once been a broad, powerful man during his younger years in the Marines, but age and illness had bent him inward. Deep folds lined his ruddy face beneath a gray beard that had grown uneven over the past few weeks, and his pale blue eyes carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent too long surviving instead of living. Despite his condition, Frank still tried joking whenever Arthur looked too worried. Old soldiers often hid fear behind humor because admitting weakness felt worse than pain itself. Arthur remained near the far corner of the room beside the frosted church windows. Even sitting down, he looked tense. The old man had changed clothes after Pastor Michael found spare winter clothing from donations, but nothing softened the guarded posture in his thin shoulders. His silver hair remained neatly combed back despite exhaustion, and the deep lines in his face became more visible beneath daylight. Jake noticed Arthur kept rubbing his left wrist unconsciously beneath the blanket covering his lap, as though remembering the bruises hidden there. Shadow rested directly beside Arthur's chair, with his massive head pressed against the old man's knee. The German shepherd had barely left Arthur alone since the previous night. Sometimes the dog lifted his ears toward the doors whenever the wind howled outside, but otherwise he remained calm, protective, strangely gentle around the elderly veteran. Pastor Michael entered carrying a tray of food while snow melted across the shoulders of his wool coat. "Road patrol just shut down the northern highway," he said quietly. "Nobody's leaving town tonight." Arthur lowered his eyes immediately at the word leaving. Jake noticed the reaction. "You expecting someone?" he asked carefully. Arthur hesitated too long before answering. "No." But Frank exhaled heavily into his tea. "That's not true." The room fell quieter. Arthur's jaw tightened slightly, though not with anger. "Shame." Frank rubbed one hand slowly across his beard before looking toward Jake. "Arthur's grandson's been trying to push him off his land for months now." Arthur stared toward the window. "Frank." "No," Frank interrupted gently. "You can't keep pretending it'll fix itself." Jake leaned silently against the kitchen counter, while Shadow's ears lifted toward Frank's voice. "The boy's name is Kevin Bennett," Frank continued. "Real estate broker down near Crystal Lake. Fancy suits, expensive trucks. Talks smooth enough people trust him too quickly." Arthur closed his eyes briefly. He wasn't always like this. Frank coughed hard before continuing. "After Arthur's wife passed 3 years ago, Kevin started helping around the ranch, paying bills, handling paperwork. At first it looked like kindness." Jake already understood where the story was heading. He had seen similar things happen to aging veterans before. Isolation, dependency, fear. The methods changed. The cruelty rarely did. Frank pointed weakly toward Arthur. That ranch near Crystal Lake belonged to Arthur's father before World War II. Family raised horses there for generations. Arthur finally spoke quietly. Developers want the land now. His voice sounded hollow beneath the storm outside. Resorts, vacation cabins, tourists from Denver. Pastor Michael's expression darkened. Kevin started managing the veteran checks first. Arthur continued slowly. Said I was forgetting things. His fingers tightened around the blanket. Then he took over the bank account because I had trouble driving in winter. Jake remained silent, letting the old man speak at his own pace. Next thing I knew, Arthur swallowed hard. Friends stopped coming by because Kevin told them I was sick or confused. Frank's tired face twisted bitterly. That bastard even shut off the heat some nights. Arthur lowered his head immediately after the words left Frank's mouth, embarrassed someone else now knew. Jake felt anger settle quietly inside his chest. Colorado winters kill old people fast, Frank muttered. Kevin knew exactly what he was doing. Shadow suddenly lifted his head toward the church entrance. A truck door slammed outside somewhere beyond the snowstorm. Arthur flinched violently, hard enough to spill tea across his blanket. The old man's breathing quickened instantly while his eyes locked onto the hallway leading toward the front doors. Shadow stood at once beside him, pressing his body gently against Arthur's legs. Jake noticed how quickly the dog responded now whenever Arthur panicked. It reminded him of combat medics calming wounded soldiers during evacuations overseas. Pastor Michael peered through the frosted glass a moment later. Just volunteers bringing firewood, he said softly. Arthur nodded too quickly, still pale. Jake watched him carefully. That reaction did not come from ordinary anxiety. It came from someone conditioned to expect punishment every time a vehicle stopped outside. Later that evening, after most volunteers settled into sleeping areas around the church, Jake stepped outside beneath the covered walkway to clear snow from the entrance. Wind sliced across the parking lot in freezing waves while distant church lights glowed faintly through the storm. Aspen Ridge looked almost abandoned beneath all the white. Shadow followed close behind him before suddenly stopping near the church steps. The German shepherd's posture changed instantly. Ears forward, body rigid. A low growl rolled from deep inside his chest. Jake followed the dog's stare toward the far edge of the property beyond the cemetery fence. At first he saw only snow moving sideways through darkness, then headlights flickered briefly between the pine trees. A black SUV sat motionless near the old cemetery road with its engine idling beneath the storm. Jake narrowed his eyes. The vehicle remained there several long seconds before slowly backing away into the snowfall and disappearing beyond the hill. Shadow's growl lingered even after the lights vanished. Jake stood very still beneath the falling snow, while cold unease settled deeper into his instincts. Inside the church behind him, Arthur Bennett sat awake beside the window once again, watching the darkness like a man who knew exactly whose vehicle had just come looking for him. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of cold steel, while fresh snow buried Aspen Ridge deeper beneath winter silence. The storm had weakened slightly during the night, but icy winds still swept through the mountain roads hard enough to keep most residents indoors. Outside St. Andrew Church, snowdrifts leaned against parked vehicles like frozen waves, and smoke curled slowly upward from chimneys across town. Inside the shelter kitchen, the smell of coffee and toasted bread mixed with the faint scent of wet wool drying beside the heaters. Jake Mercer sat alone near the back table cleaning an old flashlight with steady hands while Shadow rested beside Arthur Bennett's chair nearby. The German shepherd barely slept anymore, unless the old veteran remained within sight. Every time Arthur shifted or coughed softly, Shadow's ears twitched immediately, alert and protective. Arthur looked more exhausted than the day before. Dark circles rested beneath his pale eyes, and though Pastor Michael had convinced him to shave and change clothes again, there remained a heaviness inside the old man that no warm room could remove. He kept staring toward the church windows, where snow moved endlessly beyond the glass. Frank Doyle noticed it too. "You keep waiting for him," Frank muttered quietly while stirring sugar into his coffee. Arthur's jaw tightened. "Habit." Frank shook his head slowly. "No. Fear." The old Marine's breathing rattled harder this morning, but despite the sickness draining him, his blunt honesty remained intact. Jake quietly watched both men from across the room. Veterans often recognized truths in each other long before civilians could. Pastor Michael entered carrying folded laundry baskets filled with donated blankets. As he placed them near the hallway, several envelopes slipped from Arthur's old winter coat hanging nearby. They scattered across the floor beside the heater. Arthur froze instantly. "Those are nothing," he said too quickly while struggling to stand. But Michael had already bent down to gather them. The pastor's kind face changed slightly as he noticed the addresses written carefully across each envelope. Portland, Oregon. Some looked months old, others older. None carried postal stamps. Jake slowly lowered the flashlight into his lap. Arthur stopped moving altogether now, like a man caught exposing something deeply personal. Michael glanced gently toward him. "You never mailed these." Arthur stared toward the floor several seconds before answering. "Kevin said the roads were too dangerous most weeks. Then he said the mailbox near the ranch got vandalized." His voice sounded smaller than before. "After a while, I suppose I stopped asking questions." Frank let out a bitter breath. "Because the boy wanted nobody talking to Linda." Jake noticed Arthur's hands trembling harder now. Shadow quietly rested his heavy head against the old man's knee without looking away from him. "Your daughter?" Jake asked carefully. Arthur nodded once. "Linda Bennett. She moved to Oregon years ago after her husband died." For a moment, the old veteran's tired eyes softened with memory. "She teaches music at an elementary school near Portland." Pastor Michael carefully handed Arthur the envelopes. "She doesn't know what's happening to you." Arthur swallowed hard. "Not completely." Frank suddenly leaned back heavily in his chair. "Arthur used to talk about that girl every damn day when we were younger." A faint smile crossed the sick old Marine's face despite the coughing. "Used to carry photos of her in his wallet overseas." Arthur looked embarrassed immediately. That was a long time ago. But Frank ignored him. Little blonde thing with missing front teeth. Arthur worshipped that child. Jake studied the old veteran more carefully now. Until this moment, Arthur had seemed like a frightened man beaten down by isolation and age. But hearing Frank describe him as a father changed something. It revealed the person hidden underneath the fear. "After Korea," Frank continued quietly, "Arthur came home different." The room fell softer around his words. Snow tapped lightly against the church windows while Shadow remained perfectly still beside Arthur's chair. "Nightmares," Frank said. "Long silences. He loved his family more than anything, but war made him feel like he didn't belong inside normal life anymore." Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "Linda grew up around too much distance." His voice sounded hollow now. "I thought providing the ranch was enough." Jake understood those words more than he wanted to admit. Since Syria, he had pushed almost everyone away too. Isolation felt safer because closeness meant eventually losing someone. Pastor Michael carefully studied one of the unopened letters before returning it. You still write to her often. Arthur's tired face tightened slightly. Sometimes it's easier writing things than saying them. Jake glanced toward the envelopes. The handwriting across them looked painfully careful, like each word mattered deeply to the old man. What did Kevin tell Linda? Jake asked. Arthur hesitated. That I wanted to be left alone mostly. Frank cursed quietly under his breath. That bastard blocked every call, too. Changed Arthur's phone number twice. The heater hummed softly against the wall while silence settled through the room again. Then Arthur finally whispered the thing haunting him most. Maybe she stopped trying, because I taught her to. Michael frowned gently. Arthur stared toward the snow outside. After my wife died, I shut everybody out. Even Linda. His eyes glistened faintly now, though he fought hard against emotion. Kevin started helping after the funeral. At first I thought God sent him because I couldn't handle the ranch alone anymore. Shadow suddenly lifted his head toward the church hallway. A volunteer passed through carrying firewood, and Arthur flinched instantly at the sound of boots against the floorboards. Jake noticed how quickly the old man's fear returned whenever unexpected noise interrupted him. Trauma had rewired Arthur's instincts completely. Later that afternoon, Jake stepped outside to clear snow from the church vehicles before temperatures dropped again. The cemetery behind St. Andrew looked ghostly beneath the drifting snowfall, rows of white-covered gravestones fading into gray fog near the pine trees. Shadow followed him closely, while Jake brushed thick ice from the windshield of his old pickup truck. The cold air bit sharply against his face, but physical work helped quiet the thoughts he usually carried. Inside the church, Arthur's words lingered in his mind. Maybe she stopped trying because I taught her to. Jake understood that kind of regret too well. Then Shadow froze. The German Shepherd moved toward the backside of the truck and began scratching aggressively against the snow-covered ground near the rear tire. Low growls rumbled deep inside the dog's chest. Jake walked over immediately. Fresh footprints circled the pickup, large boot prints, recent. Snow still crumbled softly around the edges. Someone had been there only moments earlier. Shadow kept scratching and barking toward the church fence line where darkness thickened between the pines. Jake's pulse sharpened instantly. He slowly scanned the cemetery road beyond the drifting snow, but whoever had been watching was already gone. Behind him, inside the warm church windows, Arthur Bennett stood pale and motionless near the glass, staring directly at the footprints surrounding Jake's truck like a man realizing the storm had finally followed him all the way to Aspen Ridge. The snowstorm loosened its grip slightly the following afternoon, though heavy gray clouds still pressed low over Aspen Ridge like a ceiling ready to collapse across the mountains. Ice clung to the church windows in delicate white veins, while cold wind hissed softly through the pine trees surrounding the cemetery behind St. Andrew. Inside the shelter hall, volunteers moved quietly between folding tables preparing hot meals for stranded residents. The atmosphere should have felt warm, almost peaceful, yet tension lingered beneath every conversation after Jake discovered the footprints around his truck the previous night. He had not told Arthur everything. The old veteran already looked exhausted enough carrying fear inside his chest every waking moment. Arthur sat near the fireplace wrapped in a dark green wool blanket donated by one of the church families. The warmth softened some of the color back into his face, but not the nervousness. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the windows or the entrance hallway. Shadow remained stretched across the floor directly beside him, enormous paws resting over Arthur's boots like silent reassurance. Jake had seen combat dogs bond with wounded soldiers before, but something about Shadow's attachment to Arthur felt deeper than instinct now. The shepherd sensed pain, before words reached the surface. Frank Doyle slept nearby, in an old recliner beside the heater, breathing rough but steadier than before. A doctor from town had visited earlier that morning and confirmed Frank's pneumonia was serious but manageable if he stayed warm. The old Marine looked fragile while sleeping, his weathered face slack with exhaustion beneath his gray beard. But every now and then he muttered fragmented sentences from dreams that sounded decades old. War rarely stopped following men like Frank. Pastor Michael crossed the room carrying a box of donated canned food when headlights suddenly swept across the stained glass windows facing the parking lot. Arthur stiffened instantly. The teacup in his trembling hands rattled against the saucer. Shadow's head rose at once. Jake noticed the reaction before even looking outside. "Stay here," he said quietly. But Arthur was already pale. Through the frosted glass, Jake saw a black SUV slowly pull beside the church entrance. Expensive, clean despite the weather. A man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than most people in Aspen Ridge earned in a month. Kevin Bennett moved with polished confidence, the kind built from years of talking people into trusting him before they understood who he truly was. He looked about 42, tall and broad-shouldered with neatly styled dark blonde hair and trimmed stubble framing a carefully practiced smile. His expensive leather gloves matched polished black boots, untouched by snow slush. And even from across the parking lot, Jake disliked him immediately. Men who lived honestly rarely looked that rehearsed. Kevin entered the church carrying fake concern across his face like another accessory. "There you are," he said warmly the moment he spotted Arthur. The old veteran physically recoiled. The tea spilled across his blanket as his hands shook violently. Shadow surged upright immediately with a low growl rumbling through his chest. Several volunteers stopped talking. Even Pastor Michael's calm expression hardened slightly. Kevin glanced around the room with polite embarrassment. "I'm sorry if my grandfather caused trouble," he said smoothly. "His memory hasn't been good lately." Arthur stared at the floorboards, breathing too fast now. Jake stepped quietly between Kevin and the fireplace without making it obvious. "He seems clear enough to me," Jake said. Kevin finally looked at him properly. His smile remained, but the warmth inside it vanished. "And you are?" "Jake Mercer." "Ah." Kevin nodded slowly. "You're the veteran helping around the church." There was something cold beneath the friendliness now, a subtle shift most people probably missed. But Jake noticed. Men like Kevin measured threats the same way predators sized up fences. Pastor Michael moved closer beside Arthur's chair. "Your grandfather's safe here during the storm." Kevin sighed dramatically. "Pastor, I appreciate that truly. But Arthur becomes confused when he's away from home too long." Arthur's breathing turned ragged. His eyes never lifted toward Kevin. Shadow stepped directly in front of the old man now, ears rigid forward. "Arthur." Kevin continued softly, almost gently. "You know I've only been trying to help you." The words seemed to break something loose inside the old veteran. Arthur suddenly gripped the blanket tighter around himself while tears gathered helplessly in his tired eyes. "Please," he whispered. Kevin's expression tightened almost invisibly. "Come on now," he said through clenched patience. "You're upsetting yourself again." Arthur looked smaller than Jake had ever seen him. "Please don't lock me in the basement anymore." Silence crashed through the church hall. Even Frank woke at the sound of Arthur's voice. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Kevin recovered first. "He's confused," he said quickly with forced laughter. "After the stroke scare last winter, he mixes things up." But Arthur shook his head violently. "You shut the lights off down there," he whispered. "You left me there all night because I wouldn't sign the papers." Pastor Michael stared at Kevin in visible disbelief now. Several volunteers exchanged horrified looks. Jake felt something dark and old stir inside his chest. Suddenly, he was no longer standing inside St. Andrew Church. For half a second, he was 12 years old again, listening to his mother crying behind a locked garage door while snow fell outside their old house in Missouri. His stepfather had always smiled politely around neighbors, too. Always calm in public, always convincing. Jake remembered standing helplessly in the hallway, hearing his mother beg to be let inside because the winter cold hurt her hands. That memory had followed him longer than Syria ever did. Kevin's voice snapped him back. "Arthur needs medical supervision," Kevin insisted. "He hallucinates when stressed." "That's enough," Jake said quietly. The tone in his voice changed the room instantly. Kevin studied him carefully now. "This is a family matter." "No," Jake replied. "Family doesn't treat fear like discipline." Shadow's growl deepened as Kevin took another step forward. The German shepherd planted himself squarely between Arthur and the younger man, massive body, rigid, amber eyes fixed without blinking. Kevin stopped moving. For the first time since entering the church, uncertainty flickered briefly across his face. Arthur slowly lifted his head then. His pale eyes trembled with fear, but something else existed there now too. Anger. Years of silence pressed against the edge of finally breaking. "You told me nobody would believe me," Arthur whispered. Kevin's jaw tightened. "Arthur." But the old veteran suddenly looked directly at him for the first time. "I'm not signing another damn thing." The words echoed through the church hall harder than shouting. Kevin's polished mask slipped for half a second before returning again. He looked around the room, realizing too many people had heard now. Too many witnesses. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. Arthur's hands still trembled, but he did not lower his eyes anymore. Shadow remained planted beside him like a wall built from fur and old loyalty. Outside, snow continued drifting across the cemetery while Kevin Bennett slowly backed toward the church doors, wearing the expression of a man realizing control had begun slipping from his hands. The storm finally weakened enough for sunlight to break through the clouds the next morning, though Aspen Ridge still remained buried beneath deep snow and bitter cold. Pale winter light stretched across the mountains surrounding Crystal Lake, turning the frozen landscape silver beneath the endless pines. Ice covered the roads in dangerous patches while church volunteers shoveled pathways outside St. Andrew before another smaller storm rolled in later that week. Inside the shelter hall, Arthur Bennett sat quietly beside the fireplace wearing an old flannel jacket Pastor Michael had found among the donations. The previous night had exhausted him. Though he tried hiding it, fear lingered visibly inside him now that Kevin had appeared at the church openly. Every sound outside still made him tense. Frank Doyle looked worse this morning as the pneumonia drained more strength from his body. He slept often now, drifting in and out beside the heater, while Shadow remained planted near Arthur, like a silent guardian refusing to rest. Jake Mercer stood near the entrance, pulling on heavy winter gloves, when a county SUV rolled into the parking lot outside. A tall woman stepped out into the snow, wearing a dark sheriff's jacket lined with frost around the collar. Elna Brooks moved with the confident posture of someone used to command. She was 45 years old, with broad shoulders, athletic build, and sharp hazel eyes that seemed to study every detail before speaking. Her dark brown hair was tied tightly beneath a wool cap, and a faint scar curved near her chin from an old horseback accident during her younger years on her family ranch. Around Aspen Ridge, Sheriff Elena Brooks carried a reputation for fairness mixed with stubbornness. She rarely raised her voice, but people knew not to mistake her calm nature for weakness. 10 years earlier, Eleanor's father lost his retirement home after signing manipulated care documents while suffering early dementia in a nursing facility near Denver. Since then, Eleanor developed almost personal hatred toward anyone who exploited elderly people. Jake met her outside near the church steps while snow crunched beneath their boots. "Michael called me after last night," Eleanor said quietly. "Said things got ugly." Jake nodded once. "Worse than ugly." Eleanor glanced through the church windows toward Arthur sitting near the fire. Her expression hardened slightly. "I know Kevin Bennett." "That supposed to worry me?" Jake asked. "It should." She folded her gloves slowly into one hand. "Kevin donates money around town, knows county officials, plays respectable better than most criminals." Jake looked toward the mountains in the distance. "Then we stopped playing." An hour later, they drove toward Crystal Lake, with Shadow resting alert in the back seat beside emergency supplies. Arthur had reluctantly agreed to let them inspect the ranch after Eleanor explained they needed evidence stronger than accusations. The old veteran remained deeply ashamed anyone would see how he had been living. As the truck climbed the frozen road above the lake, Jake studied the property ahead through drifting snow. Arthur's ranch sat isolated beneath towering pines overlooking the dark, frozen water of Crystal Lake. Once it must have been beautiful. Even neglected, the place carried traces of dignity beneath decay. The main house was an aging two-story structure with weathered cedar walls and a wide porch now buried beneath snowdrifts. A red horse barn leaned slightly near the frozen fence line while broken wind chimes rattled weakly against the porch roof. "Kevin wanted this place for developers?" Jake asked quietly. Eleanor nodded. "Land around the lake's worth millions now." They stepped inside through the front entrance after Arthur unlocked the door with shaking hands. The house smelled stale and cold, despite the furnace humming faintly somewhere beneath the floorboards. Dust covered most surfaces. Family photographs had been removed from the walls except for pale outlines where frames once hung. Shadow immediately began moving room to room, sniffing carefully, ears twitching at every creak inside the old ranch house. Jake noticed Arthur watching the dog almost nervously now, like he feared what Shadow might uncover. Elena moved toward the kitchen first. Stacks of overdue utility notices covered part of the counter beside unopened medication bottles. She picked up several envelopes silently before exhaling through her nose. Electric company records show the power got shut off 4 different times last winter. Arthur lowered his eyes immediately. Kevin said billing errors happen in mountain towns. Jake opened the refrigerator. Nearly empty. Mostly expired food. "You were living like this alone?" Arthur hesitated too long before answering. "Kevin handled shopping most weeks." Elena crouched beside a lower cabinet and discovered several orange prescription bottles shoved far into the back behind cleaning supplies. Her jaw tightened. "Heart medication." Arthur looked pale now. "I thought I lost those." Jake exchanged a glance with Elena. Neither spoke. They did not need to. Upstairs looked worse. The master bedroom remained strangely bare except for an old military photograph resting beside the bed. In it, a much younger Arthur Bennett stood smiling beside fellow soldiers during the Korean War, broad-shouldered and proud beneath snow-covered mountains overseas. Jake noticed how different Arthur's eyes looked back then. Alive. In the hallway, Elena suddenly stopped near a narrow wooden staircase leading downward. "Basement." Arthur visibly stiffened. Shadow began growling low before anyone moved closer. The old veteran's hands shook badly now. "You don't need to see down there." Jake looked directly at him. "Arthur." The old man swallowed hard. Kevin used to lock it from outside. Elena slowly descended the stairs first, with her flashlight cutting through darkness below. The basement smelled damp and freezing cold even now. Concrete walls sweated moisture while exposed pipes rattled overhead. Jake immediately noticed the heavy metal latch bolted outside the basement doorframe. Not inside. Outside. Elena stared at it several long seconds without speaking. "Jesus," she muttered softly. Arthur remained near the staircase, unable to step fully into the room. He said, "I wondered when confused." His voice cracked slightly. "Sometimes he left me here overnight until I agreed to sign papers." Jake felt anger settle heavily inside his chest again. Shadow walked slowly across the basement floor, sniffing carefully near old filing cabinets stacked against one wall. Elena opened several drawers while Jake searched nearby shelves. They quickly found property transfer forms bearing Arthur's forged signatures, banking authorizations, and legal documents already prepared for land acquisition companies. "This is enough for fraud investigation already," Elena said quietly. Then Shadow stopped abruptly near the far corner of the basement. The German Shepherd scratched aggressively against loose wooden boards beneath an old workbench while deep growls rolled through his chest. Jake knelt beside him and pulled the warped boards aside carefully. Hidden beneath the floor sat a small rusted steel box wrapped inside oilcloth. Arthur stared at it from the staircase with confusion and sudden fear mixing together across his pale face. Shadow continued growling softly at the hidden container while Jake slowly lifted the old metal box into the dim basement light. Snow melted slowly from the rooftops of Aspen Ridge during the next 2 days, while pale winter sunlight finally reached the valley again after nearly a week of storms. Crystal Lake remained frozen beneath sheets of silver ice, but the roads into town gradually reopened as plows carved narrow paths through the mountains. Around St. Andrew Church, volunteers continued serving hot meals and helping stranded residents recover from the blizzard. Yet beneath the quiet rhythm of normal life returning, tension spread quietly through the town after rumors began circulating about Kevin Bennett and the Bennett Ranch near the lake. People lowered their voices whenever the subject surfaced. In small mountain towns, secrets rarely stayed buried forever. Inside the church office, Jake Mercer placed the rusted steel box carefully onto Pastor Michael's desk, while Shadow lay nearby, watching every movement. Arthur Bennett sat silently beside the window, hands trembling faintly in his lap. The old veteran had barely spoken during the drive back from the ranch the previous evening. Discovering the hidden box seemed to frighten him almost as much as the basement itself. Elena Brooks removed her gloves slowly before prying the rusted lid open. Inside rested several old VHS tapes wrapped in plastic alongside faded camera manuals and dusty wires from an outdated home surveillance system. "Security recordings," Elena muttered. Jake glanced toward Arthur. "You knew these existed?" Arthur shook his head weakly. "Kevin handled the cameras after break-ins near the barn years ago." Pastor Michael frowned. "Maybe he forgot these." "Or thought they were destroyed already," Elena replied quietly. The sheriff borrowed an old VHS player from the church storage room later that afternoon. The machine barely worked anymore. Its plastic casing yellowed with age, but eventually static flickered across the television screen inside the church meeting room. Arthur sat rigidly in his chair while Shadow rested against his boots. Frank Doyle remained nearby, wrapped in blankets despite his worsening cough. The old Marine insisted on staying. "If that bastard's face is on those tapes," Frank rasped, "I want to see it." The first recording showed harmless footage from the ranch kitchen months earlier. Arthur drinking coffee, snow outside, empty hallways. Then another tape changed everything. The timestamp flickered across the screen while grainy footage revealed Arthur standing near the kitchen table looking smaller and weaker than he did now. Kevin Bennett entered the frame holding several papers. Even through distorted video quality, the younger man's body language felt cold, controlled, dangerous. "Sign the transfer agreement," Kevin said sharply through crackling speakers. Arthur shook his head weakly in the recording. "The land stays with family." Kevin slammed the papers onto the table hard enough to make Arthur flinch. "There won't be any family left if you lose the ranch entirely." The room inside St. Andrew Church became painfully still. Jake watched Arthur's face instead of the screen. Shame hollowed the old veteran's expression deeper with every passing second. On the tape, Kevin suddenly grabbed a bottle from Arthur's hands. Heart medication. "Maybe when your chest starts hurting again, you'll think more clearly," Kevin snapped. Arthur on the recording looked terrified. Not angry. Terrified. Frank cursed softly beneath his breath beside the television. Then the footage worsened. Another tape showed Frank himself stepping into the ranch kitchen while Kevin cornered Arthur near the counter. "Leave him alone!" Frank shouted through the old speakers. Kevin shoved the older Marine violently backward. Frank crashed hard against the floor beside the table. Even now, watching months later, the old man instinctively grabbed his ribs, remembering the pain. Arthur cried out in the video and tried helping Frank up, but Kevin blocked him. "You want him freezing in a state nursing home?" Kevin hissed toward Arthur. "Then keep refusing me." Elena paused the tape. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Pastor Michael looked physically sick. Jake felt something dark tightening inside his chest again, the same cold anger he used to feel before missions overseas when innocent people got cornered by men who mistook cruelty for power. Arthur suddenly stood shakily from his chair. I should have stopped him sooner. Jake looked toward him immediately. "Arthur?" "No." The old veteran's eyes glistened faintly. "Frank got hurt because I stayed afraid too long." Frank coughed hard before answering. "You stayed alive. That's different." But Arthur lowered his head. "I used to think surviving war made me strong." His voice trembled quietly. Turns out fear can still own a man even 50 years later. Later that evening, Jake sat alone inside the church gymnasium where folding chairs formed a small circle beneath dim lights. A weekly PTSD support meeting for veterans had started again after the storm. Usually, Jake avoided those gatherings. Sitting in circles talking about pain felt unnatural to him. Weak even. But after watching the tapes, something inside him shifted. Around the room sat 6 veterans from different generations, some old enough to remember Vietnam, others younger, carrying Afghanistan or Iraq in their eyes. A tall black man named Curtis Nolan sat nearest the coffee table, broad through the shoulders despite his age. Curtis had once served as an army medic in Fallujah and now walked with a cane after an explosion shattered his knee years earlier. He spoke softly but listened intensely whenever others talked. Beside him sat Diane Mercer, a retired Air Force helicopter pilot in her early 50s with cropped silver blonde hair and weathered skin from decades flying rescue missions overseas. She carried herself with sharp discipline, but Jake noticed how tightly she held her coffee whenever loud sounds echoed nearby. Pastor Michael opened the session gently. "Nobody here needs to pretend tonight." Silence lingered a while before Curtis finally spoke. "You know what guilt does?" he asked quietly. "It convinces you isolation is punishment you deserve." Jake stared at the floor. Curtis continued. Problem is, loneliness doesn't heal anybody. It just gives ghosts quieter rooms to speak. Those words stayed with Jake long after the meeting ended. Maybe because deep down he already knew they were true. For nearly 2 years he had treated suffering like debt that needed repayment through isolation. But Arthur's fear had shown him something different. Broken people sometimes survived only because someone stayed beside them long enough to remind them they still mattered. The following morning, Elena Brooks drove toward downtown Aspen Ridge with 2 county deputies behind her patrol truck. Snowmelt dripped steadily from rooftops, while locals moved carefully along reopened sidewalks, carrying groceries and firewood beneath gray skies. Kevin Bennett's real estate office stood near the center of town between a coffee shop and insurance building. Large windows displayed glossy advertisements for luxury lake properties and future resort developments. Kevin himself stood near the front desk wearing another expensive suit when Elena entered with the deputies. Several townspeople nearby immediately slowed to watch through the glass. Kevin smiled automatically at first. "Sheriff Brooks, what can I do for—" "Kevin Bennett," Elena interrupted calmly. "You're under arrest for elder abuse, financial fraud, unlawful imprisonment, and aggravated assault." The smile vanished. Outside, Jake watched silently from across the street beside Shadow, while people gathered along the sidewalks whispering in shock. Kevin's face twisted between anger and disbelief as deputies placed him in handcuffs before the entire town. For the first time since entering St. Andrew Church days earlier, Kevin Bennett no longer looked powerful. He looked afraid. And miles away at the church near Crystal Lake, Arthur Bennett sat quietly beside the fire with tears filling his tired old eyes as the weight of fear he carried for years finally began loosening its grip. The news of Kevin Bennett's arrest spread across Aspen Ridge faster than the melting snow running down the mountain roads. By the following morning, conversations about the Bennett Ranch filled the coffee shops, grocery stores, and church parking lots throughout town. Some people reacted with shock. Others quietly admitted they had always suspected something felt wrong whenever Arthur Bennett appeared beside his grandson during town events. Winter sunlight now stretched longer across Crystal Lake each afternoon, softening the ice around the shoreline, while dark water slowly began breaking through beneath the frozen surface. The storms had finally passed, yet inside Arthur Bennett another storm still lingered. He sat near the church fireplace wrapped in a gray cardigan Pastor Michael had found for him earlier that week. Without the constant fear of Kevin suddenly appearing, the old veteran looked less tense than before, but exhaustion remained carved deeply into his face. Years of isolation did not disappear simply because handcuffs finally closed around the man responsible. Shadow rested across Arthur's boots like he belonged there permanently now. Sometimes the German shepherd lifted his heavy head whenever Arthur shifted uncomfortably in the chair, almost checking whether the old man still needed guarding. Jake Mercer stood nearby, replacing firewood beside the stone fireplace when Pastor Michael entered carrying an envelope. "Arthur," the pastor said softly, "someone called from Oregon." Arthur froze immediately. Even Frank Doyle slowly lowered his coffee cup beside the heater. "Linda?" Arthur whispered. Michael nodded gently. "She's driving here now." Silence settled through the church hall. Arthur stared at the fire several long seconds without speaking. His hands trembled slightly against the blanket covering his knees. Jake noticed fear returning to the old man's face again, but not the same kind Kevin caused. This fear came from regret. Frank exhaled slowly beside the heater. "About damn time." Arthur closed his eyes briefly. "I don't know what to say to her anymore." Jake understood that feeling better than most people realized. After Syria, he had ignored calls from his younger sister for nearly 8 months because he no longer knew how to explain the version of himself that returned home. War changed language between people, long before it changed faces. Linda Bennett arrived in Aspen Ridge late the following evening after driving nearly 14 hours through mountain highways from Portland. Jake happened to be outside clearing snow from the church walkway when an aging blue Subaru pulled carefully into the parking lot. A woman stepped out slowly, pausing several seconds before approaching the church entrance. Linda Bennett looked younger than Jake expected, perhaps 53 or 54, though exhaustion added years to her face. She was tall and slender, like her father once must have been, with shoulder-length blonde hair touched lightly with silver near the temples. Her pale skin carried the softness of someone more accustomed to classrooms and quiet music halls than mountain winters. Yet despite the gentleness in her appearance, there was strength inside her posture too. The kind developed by people forced to survive disappointments quietly. She held Arthur's unopened letters tightly against her chest beneath a dark wool coat. Jake could immediately tell she had been crying during the drive. "You're Jake Mercer?" she asked softly. Her voice carried warmth despite obvious nervousness. Jake nodded once. "He's inside." Linda glanced toward the church windows glowing against the evening snow. "I kept thinking maybe Kevin exaggerated things." Her eyes lowered toward the letters. "Then the sheriff sent copies of these." Jake noticed how tightly her fingers squeezed the envelopes. "He wrote to you often." Linda swallowed hard. "I thought he stopped caring." Inside the church, Arthur stood slowly the moment Linda entered the room. For several seconds, neither moved. Shadow rose quietly from beside the fireplace but did not growl. Somehow the dog understood this moment belonged to healing instead of fear. Arthur looked smaller than ever standing there in borrowed clothes beneath the church lights. Linda looked at him like someone seeing both her father and a stranger simultaneously. "Dad," she whispered. Arthur opened his mouth twice before words finally came. "You drove all this way." Linda's eyes immediately filled with tears. "You disappeared." The sentence struck harder than anger would have. Frank quietly lowered his head near the heater, while Pastor Michael stepped silently into the hallway to give them privacy. Arthur's shoulders sagged beneath years of guilt, suddenly becoming impossible to avoid. "I thought I was protecting you," he admitted softly. Linda shook her head. "By shutting me out." Arthur stared toward the floorboards. "After your mother died, I stopped knowing how to talk to people anymore." His voice trembled now, especially the people I loved most. Jake stood near the doorway watching silently while Shadow moved closer beside Linda, gently pressing against her hand. The German shepherd had accepted her immediately, perhaps because Arthur's scent lived in her too. Linda knelt instinctively to pet him, and the simple touch finally broke whatever emotional wall she still carried. Tears slipped freely down her face now. "Kevin kept telling me you wanted to be alone," she whispered. Arthur looked physically ill hearing that. "No." His eyes glistened heavily. "God, no." Frank suddenly spoke from across the room, voice rough from sickness and shame. "I should have called you sooner." Linda looked toward him. The old Marine rubbed one hand across his beard tiredly. "I kept thinking Arthur would handle it eventually." His breathing rattled deeper before continuing. "Truth is, I was scared too." Linda walked slowly toward her father then. "Why didn't you tell me what he was doing?" Arthur hesitated painfully long before answering. "Because fathers aren't supposed to become burdens." Jake felt something tighten quietly inside his chest again. Curtis Nolan's words from the PTSD meeting echoed back through his memory. "Loneliness doesn't heal anybody. It just gives ghosts quieter rooms to speak. Arthur suddenly reached for Linda's hand with trembling fingers. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for every birthday call I missed, every Christmas I stayed quiet, every year you thought I stopped loving you." Linda broke completely then. She stepped forward and wrapped both arms around her father while tears shook through her body. Arthur held her carefully like a man terrified the moment might disappear if he moved too fast. Frank wiped his eyes roughly with one sleeve while pretending to cough again. Jake quietly looked away toward the church windows to give them dignity. Then Linda noticed the bruising still faintly visible along Arthur's wrists where his sleeves shifted upward beneath the firelight. Her face crumpled instantly. "Dad," she whispered through tears. Arthur lowered his eyes in shame, but Linda only held him tighter as years of distance finally collapsed between them beside the warm church fireplace while Shadow rested silently at their feet, like an old soldier guarding what little remained sacred in the world. Spring arrived slowly in Aspen Ridge like an old hymn returning after a long winter silence. Snow still clung to the mountain shadows during early mornings, but warm sunlight now spilled across Crystal Lake each afternoon, melting the frozen shoreline into silver streams that wound gently through the pines. The air no longer smelled of storms and fear. Instead, wet earth, pine sap, and thawing grass drifted through the valley while birds returned to the ranches surrounding the lake. People in town smiled more easily now. Windows opened again. Trucks rolled down muddy roads instead of icy ones. Life, stubborn and patient, had started moving forward once more. Nearly 3 months had passed since Kevin Bennett's arrest. The court hearings moved faster than most expected after the VHS tapes surfaced, along with forged property documents and medical neglect reports from the sheriff's office. By early April, the judge officially restored full ownership of the Crystal Lake Ranch and all remaining assets back to Arthur Bennett. Kevin now waited in county jail for sentencing while lawyers untangled years of financial fraud hidden beneath fake contracts and manipulated accounts. Arthur still struggled understanding how close he had come to losing everything his family built over generations. Yet each morning inside the old ranch house, healing slowly replaced fear, one ordinary moment at a time. The ranch itself looked alive again. Fresh white paint covered the porch railings while repaired fence posts stretched across the fields near the barn. Electric lights glowed warmly through the windows at night instead of leaving the house dark and abandoned against the mountains. Linda Bennett stayed in Aspen Ridge longer than originally planned, helping her father restore the property room by room. Sometimes Jake Mercer watched them from the barn doorway while fixing old tools or repairing stall doors alongside Frank Doyle. Linda often laughed softly while arguing with Arthur over small things like curtains, coffee brands, or where her mother's piano should sit inside the living room. Those ordinary disagreements felt strangely beautiful after years of silence between them. Arthur looked stronger too. Not younger exactly, but lighter somehow. His shoulders no longer curled inward every time a vehicle stopped near the driveway. The bruises on his wrists faded slowly beneath spring sunlight, though some nights Jake still caught the old veteran checking locks before bed out of habit. Trauma did not disappear because court papers changed, but it loosened its grip little by little. Shadow had become almost permanently attached to the ranch now. The German Shepherd moved through the property with calm confidence, patrolling fences each morning before lying beneath the porch during warm afternoons, while children from neighboring ranches stopped to pet him through the rails. Around Aspen Ridge, people started calling Shadow the guardian of Crystal Lake. Pastor Michael laughed whenever he heard it, though even he admitted the old military dog seemed to understand broken people unusually well. The church basement had transformed too. After Kevin's arrest, St. Andrew opened a permanent outreach center for elderly residents, struggling veterans, and families facing financial abuse. Volunteers helped older ranchers review contracts and legal paperwork, while Elena Brooks worked with county attorneys to create stronger protections for vulnerable seniors living alone in the mountain communities. Every Thursday evening, the church hosted free support meetings, where people shared stories they once buried beneath shame. Shadow always attended beside Jake. Somehow the dog became the unofficial mascot of the entire center. Elderly widows brought him biscuits. Veterans scratched behind his ears before speaking about nightmares they hid from their families for years. Even children waiting with parents during legal consultations sat beside him reading books with one hand resting against his thick fur. Jake noticed something important during those weeks. People often spoke more honestly whenever Shadow sat nearby. Perhaps because dogs never judged weakness. One bright Saturday morning, Aspen Ridge Elementary organized a spring picnic near Crystal Lake. Linda convinced Arthur to attend after weeks of refusing. "Nobody wants to hear old war stories," Arthur muttered while buttoning his flannel shirt. "Dad," Linda sighed patiently, "you survived history. Let people listen." The picnic gathered nearly half the town beneath rows of pine trees near the shoreline. Children chased each other across the grass while folding tables overflowed with homemade pies and casseroles. Frank Doyle sat near the lake wrapped in a denim jacket, despite lingering weakness from pneumonia, grumbling about fishing conditions while secretly enjoying every minute outside. Jake helped unload chairs from church trucks until a group of children surrounded Shadow beneath one of the picnic tents. Arthur watched quietly from a distance at first. Then a little boy named Caleb Turner approached him holding a toy soldier in one hand. Caleb was only 8 years old, skinny beneath oversized overalls with freckles scattered across his cheeks and bright brown eyes, full of endless curiosity. "Were you really in the war?" the boy asked carefully. Arthur looked startled. "Long time ago." Caleb nodded seriously. "My grandpa says soldiers get lonely after wars." For several seconds Arthur could not answer. Then slowly, he sat beside the child beneath the pine trees, while more children gathered nearby. He began speaking softly about Korea. Not the violence, not the blood. Instead, he told stories about freezing mountain nights, writing letters home beside campfires, and soldiers sharing coffee during snowstorms because kindness mattered most when fear surrounded everyone. Jake noticed the change almost immediately. Arthur's voice grew steadier while speaking. His eyes brightened with memories that no longer belonged entirely to pain. Nearby, Linda quietly wiped tears from her face while pretending to organize picnic plates. Frank leaned heavily against his folding chair and muttered toward Jake. "First time I've heard him talk like that in 40 years. Jake glanced toward the old veteran surrounded by laughing children and realized Frank was probably right. That evening, the ranch glowed warmly beneath golden sunset spilling across Crystal Lake. Wind moved softly through the open windows while Linda cooked dinner inside the kitchen, and Frank complained about burnt cornbread from the porch swing outside. Jake repaired one final fence post near the barn before noticing Arthur standing beside Shadow in the fading light. The old veteran rested one weathered hand gently against the German shepherd's neck. "You know," Arthur said quietly, "I used to lock my bedroom door every night, even before Kevin." Jake looked toward him. Arthur stared at the lake. "War teaches men strange habits." He smiled faintly then. "Fear just gave those habits sharper teeth." Inside the ranch later that night, Linda kissed her father's cheek before heading upstairs while soft piano music drifted through the house from an old record player she restored earlier that week. Jake prepared to leave when Arthur suddenly stopped him near the hallway. "Thank you," the old veteran whispered. Jake shook his head once. "You did the hard part." Arthur looked toward Shadow, sleeping peacefully beside the fireplace. "No," he replied softly. "The hard part was believing somebody would stay." Long after midnight, moonlight spilled quietly across the ranch house beside Crystal Lake. Upstairs, Arthur Bennett lay awake in bed, listening to the ordinary sounds of spring wind moving through open trees outside. No footsteps approached his door. No locks rattled. No fear waited in the hallway anymore. For the first time in years, the old veteran closed his eyes and finally fell asleep without locking the bedroom door. Spring settled fully over Aspen Ridge by late April, washing the valley in soft green colors that had seemed impossible only months earlier during the storms. Snow still rested along the highest mountain ridges beyond Crystal Lake, but the lower trails opened again beneath warm sunlight and clear skies. Wildflowers pushed carefully through thawed earth beside old fence lines while horses wandered the Bennett Ranch fields beneath golden afternoons. Around town, people no longer spoke about Kevin Bennett every day. Life had begun reclaiming its normal rhythm. Yet for Jake Mercer, peace carried its own strange kind of uncertainty now. He stood alone near the ranch barn one quiet morning, repairing an old saddle rack while Shadow slept nearby in the grass beneath a cottonwood tree. The German shepherd looked older lately, more relaxed too. Gray fur had started spreading around his muzzle over the past year, softening the sharp military appearance he once carried overseas. But the dog's eyes remained alert, intelligent, deeply aware of the emotions moving around him. Jake often wondered whether Shadow understood more about human pain than most people did. A dusty pickup truck rolled slowly toward the barn across the gravel road. Jake recognized the vehicle immediately. Navy blue government plates. His stomach tightened before the engine even stopped. Commander Russell Hayes stepped out wearing civilian clothes beneath an old leather jacket weathered from years near saltwater bases and deployment zones. Hayes was 58 years old with broad shoulders gone slightly heavier with age and a square face marked by deep lines around the mouth from decades giving orders in impossible situations. His cropped gray hair and thick mustache gave him the appearance of an old war film officer, but beneath the hard exterior lived a surprisingly patient man who had once pulled Jake from a sinking extraction boat during a mission off the Yemeni coast years earlier. Hayes rarely smiled much, but younger SEALs trusted him because he never abandoned his men. "Mercer," Hayes called while stepping from the truck. Jake straightened slowly. "Sir." Hayes glanced around the ranch with quiet approval. "Hell of a place to disappear." Shadow rose from the grass and approached carefully, sniffing the commander's hand before accepting him. "Dog remembers me," Hayes muttered. "Smarter than most officers I trained." Jake almost smiled at that. Almost. The commander's expression softened slightly while he looked toward the mountains surrounding Crystal Lake. "You've been gone longer than expected." Jake leaned against the barn doorway. "Didn't plan on staying." Hayes nodded once. "Funny thing about helping people. Plans usually stop mattering." The older man handed Jake a sealed envelope. Official Navy orders. Jake already knew what waited inside before opening it. Return to Coronado Naval Base. Temporary leave extension denied. Deployment evaluations resumed within 30 days. The words felt strangely heavier than they should have. Months earlier, Jake would have accepted them without hesitation. Movement had always felt easier than stillness. Missions, bases, war zones. Constant motion prevented him from thinking too long about Syria or Ryan Walker or the guilt sitting permanently inside his chest. But Aspen Ridge changed something. Hayes studied him carefully. "You don't look ready to leave." Jake stared toward the ranch house, where Arthur and Linda laughed softly while repainting porch railings together beneath spring sunlight. "Maybe I'm finally tired of running." The commander remained silent several seconds. "You know what Ryan hated most about you?" Jake looked sharply toward him. Hayes folded his arms. "You always thought surviving meant carrying everything alone." The words landed harder than Jake expected. Before he could answer, Arthur Bennett slowly approached from the porch, carrying 2 cups of coffee in weathered hands. The old veteran moved more steadily now. Though age still bent his frame slightly, fear no longer controlled every movement he made. His silver hair lifted gently in the wind, while sunlight touched the deep lines in his face. Arthur offered 1 cup toward Hayes politely. "You must be the man sending him away." Hayes accepted the coffee carefully. "Trying to." Arthur smiled faintly. "Good luck with that." Later that afternoon, Jake drove into Aspen Ridge for supplies, while Shadow rested beside him inside the truck. Downtown looked alive beneath the warm weather. Children rode bicycles near the lake road, while tourists slowly returned to the mountain shops after winter ended. Jake stopped near the church outreach center, where Eleanor Brooks stood unloading donated furniture from a trailer with several volunteers. She wore rolled-up sheriff sleeves beneath the sunlight, revealing strong forearms marked by faint scars from ranch work and years carrying equipment through rough mountain terrain. Her dark hair had escaped its usual tight ponytail, falling loosely around her face while sweat glistened lightly against sun-touched skin. Jake noticed something he had not allowed himself to notice before. Elana was beautiful, not in fragile ways, in steady ones. The kind built from resilience and kindness surviving together. She looked toward him and smiled immediately. "You planning to help or supervise?" Jake grabbed one side of the furniture without answering. Elena laughed softly. Around them, volunteers organized donations for the Elderly Assistance Center, now operating full-time beneath St. Andrew Church. An older widow named Marjorie Ellis directed people near the doorway with impressive authority, despite being nearly 75. Marjorie was short and stout, with curly white hair and bright green eyes that missed absolutely nothing happening around her. After losing her husband to Alzheimer's years earlier, she dedicated most of her time helping isolated seniors throughout the county. She adored Shadow completely and often smuggled him homemade bacon treats despite repeated warnings from everyone. "That dog's skinnier every week," Marjorie insisted constantly, though Shadow clearly weighed nearly 90 pounds. As the afternoon faded, Jake and Elena sat together outside the church watching sunset spill across the valley in shades of orange and gold. Wind moved softly through the pines while distant church bells echoed faintly from town. Neither spoke for a while. Comfortable silence had become easier between them lately. Elena finally glanced sideways toward him. "Michael told me your orders came." Jake nodded once. "Coronado. How long?" "Don't know yet." Elena looked toward the mountains quietly. "Funny thing about soldiers." Jake waited. "Some save lives with weapons," she said softly. "Others save people just by staying long enough to remind them they matter." The words settled deep inside him, because he knew she was not only talking about Arthur anymore. Jake stared toward Shadow lying peacefully near the church steps, surrounded by children scratching behind his ears. Months ago, he would have dismissed Elena's words entirely. Weak sentiment, temporary comfort. But now he understood something different. Healing did not always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it appeared quietly through ordinary people refusing to leave when life became difficult. That evening, back at Crystal Lake, Arthur asked Jake to walk with him near the shoreline before dinner. The lake reflected sunset colors across the calm water, while spring birds moved through the reeds nearby. Arthur carried something small, wrapped carefully in cloth beneath one arm. "My father gave this to me after Korea," the old veteran said quietly once they stopped near the dock. He unwrapped the cloth slowly, revealing an old military insignia pin from the 7th Infantry Division, weathered with age, but polished carefully over decades. "You should keep it now." Jake immediately shook his head. "Arthur, take it." The old veteran's pale eyes held steady warmth now instead of fear. "That thing survived 2 wars, and one stubborn old man." A faint smile touched his face. "Seems appropriate." Jake accepted the insignia carefully between rough fingers. The metal felt surprisingly heavy. Arthur looked out across Crystal Lake while evening wind moved gently through his silver hair. "I used to think strength meant enduring pain quietly," he admitted. "Turns out strength might just mean letting people care about you before it's too late." Jake looked toward the ranch house glowing warmly beneath the sunset where Linda and Frank prepared dinner inside, while Shadow waited near the porch steps. For the first time in years, the future no longer looked entirely empty to him. And standing beside Crystal Lake beneath the fading spring light, Jake Mercer finally realized surviving life was not the same thing as learning how to live it. Early summer settled over Aspen Ridge with warm sunlight stretching across Crystal Lake from dawn until late evening, turning the mountains gold beneath endless Colorado skies. The harsh winter storms that once buried the valley now felt almost distant, like memories fading slowly into another lifetime. Pine trees swayed gently in the breeze surrounding the Bennett Ranch, while wildflowers spread across the fields near the horse barn in bright patches of yellow and violet. The old ranch no longer looked haunted by silence and fear. It looked lived in again, alive again. On the final morning before Jake Mercer's departure, the air smelled of fresh grass, coffee drifting from open kitchen windows, and lake water warming beneath the summer sun. Jake stood outside the barn loading the last of his gear into the back of his pickup truck, while Shadow rested nearby beneath the porch steps. The German Shepherd looked peaceful in ways Jake had not seen since before Syria. His thick black and tan fur glowed beneath the sunlight while the breeze moved softly around the gray fur spreading across his muzzle. The old military dog no longer watched every shadow like an approaching threat. He simply watched people now, listened to laughter, slept without twitching from old battlefield memories. Around the ranch, life moved gently in ordinary rhythms. Frank Doyle sat beside the lake holding a fishing pole while complaining loudly about trout that lost all respect for old Marines. Though pneumonia still left him weaker than before winter, color had returned to his weathered face, and the bitterness that once lived permanently inside him had softened into something closer to peace. Every few minutes he exchanged sarcastic insults with Arthur Bennett across the dock while secretly smiling whenever he thought nobody noticed. Arthur himself looked stronger than anyone expected possible only months earlier. He moved slower than younger men, of course, but no longer like someone waiting for punishment to arrive at the front door. His silver hair shone beneath the morning light while his faded denim shirt hung loosely over shoulders no longer bent entirely by fear. Most evenings now he sat on the porch with Linda eating dinner while soft music drifted from the old piano inside the ranch house. Every Sunday after church, Linda cooked family meals large enough to feed half Aspen Ridge. Arthur even laughed again sometimes. Real laughter. The kind that startled him the first few times it escaped. Jake noticed another difference too. Whenever vehicles rolled up the gravel road toward the ranch now, Arthur no longer flinched or searched for hiding places. He simply looked up calmly to see who had arrived. Healing moved slowly, but it moved. Inside Aspen Ridge, St. Andrew Church had changed almost as much as the ranch itself. What began as temporary shelter during the blizzard had grown into something larger than anyone expected. Pastor Michael and Elena Brooks officially launched a statewide outreach network helping elderly veterans and isolated seniors facing financial abuse, neglect, or emotional control. Volunteers from neighboring counties now visited Aspen Ridge weekly to train at the church center. Lawyers donated legal services. Therapists offered counseling. Ranchers delivered food and firewood to elderly residents living alone in remote mountain areas. Newspapers across Colorado began calling the program the Crystal Lake Initiative. Pastor Michael hated the attention, but Elena secretly enjoyed watching him pretend otherwise. That morning, the church parking lot overflowed with trucks and familiar faces because nearly the entire town had gathered to see Jake leave. Marjorie Ellis organized farewell casseroles near the fellowship hall while loudly scolding volunteers who tried carrying heavy boxes without proper lifting posture. Curtis Nolan leaned beside the church railing trading war stories with younger veterans, while Diane Mercer distributed donated blankets inside the outreach office. Even little Caleb Turner arrived wearing an oversized cowboy hat and carrying a hand-drawn picture of Shadow standing heroically beside Crystal Lake. "For the Navy dog," Caleb announced proudly. Shadow accepted the drawing with more dignity than most politicians accepted awards. Jake tried pretending the attention made him uncomfortable, though deep down something inside him warmed painfully at the sight of so many people gathered together peacefully. Months earlier, he would have slipped away quietly before sunrise rather than let anyone say goodbye. But Aspen Ridge had changed him too. Elena Brooks approached while Jake finished securing equipment in the truck bed. She wore plain jeans and a light brown sheriff's jacket instead of her uniform this morning. Her dark hair moved freely in the summer breeze while sunlight touched the scar near her chin softly enough that it almost disappeared. Jake noticed faint exhaustion beneath her hazel eyes from weeks building the outreach program, yet she still carried the same steady calm that first caught his attention back during winter. "You packed enough gear to invade another country," she teased quietly. Jake leaned against the truck. "Old habits." Elena nodded thoughtfully. "You planning on coming back?" The question lingered between them longer than either expected. Jake looked toward the ranch house beyond the lake where Arthur and Linda stood together laughing near the porch steps, while Frank argued with a broken fence gate nearby. For the first time in years, leaving somewhere actually hurt. "Yeah," he admitted softly. "I think I am." Elena smiled then, small but genuine. She stepped closer and adjusted the collar of his jacket almost absent-mindedly. "Good," she whispered. "Some people finally learned how to need you around here." Before Jake could answer, Arthur slowly approached, carrying a small wooden box beneath one arm. Shadow immediately rose and walked beside the old veteran as though escorting him personally. Arthur handed the box carefully toward Jake. Inside rested the old Korean War insignia beside several faded photographs newly restored by Linda. One showed Arthur as a young soldier smiling beside fellow Marines during winter overseas. Another showed Linda as a child, sitting on his shoulders near the Crystal Lake barn decades earlier. "Family belongs in pockets," Arthur said quietly, "not hidden away in drawers." Jake looked at the photographs several seconds before closing the box gently. "I'll keep them safe." Arthur smiled faintly. "I know." Nearby, church bells echoed softly across Aspen Ridge while townspeople gathered closer around the truck. Pastor Michael offered a prayer for safe travels. Marjorie cried openly, despite denying it moments later. Frank shouted one final insult about Navy uniforms looking too clean to trust. Laughter rolled through the crowd beneath the warm Colorado sunlight. Then Jake climbed into the driver's seat while Shadow jumped into the passenger side with surprising energy for an aging military dog. Before starting the engine, Jake paused a moment, looking through the windshield toward the ranch beside Crystal Lake. Arthur stood on the porch beside Linda with one arm resting gently across her shoulders. Frank repaired the fence near the barn while pretending not to wave goodbye. Eleanor stood near the church road watching quietly with sunlight in her dark hair. Every window in the old ranch house stood open wide beneath the summer breeze. No doors remained locked anymore. Jake started the truck slowly. As the tires rolled down the gravel road away from Aspen Ridge, Shadow leaned his head out the passenger window into the warm Colorado wind, while mountains stretched endlessly beneath clear blue skies ahead. And behind them, near the shining waters of Crystal Lake, the old ranch remained standing strong beneath the sunlight, with laughter drifting softly from the porch, and every door finally left open. Because sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder, angels, or voices from heaven. Sometimes they arrive quietly through one exhausted soldier, willing to stop in the middle of a storm, long enough to hear the cry for help everyone else ignored. Sometimes God does not send miracles through thunder, angels, or great signs in the sky. Sometimes he sends them quietly through ordinary people who choose kindness when the world turns away. A tired soldier who stops to listen, an old dog who refuses to leave someone trembling in fear, a daughter who finally comes home before it is too late. And maybe that is the lesson hidden inside every wounded heart. No matter how broken life becomes, God can still open doors we thought were locked forever. There are people around us right now carrying silent pain behind closed curtains and polite smiles, especially the elderly, the lonely, the veterans, and those who believe they have already been forgotten. Sometimes a warm conversation, a phone call, or simply staying beside someone a little longer can become the miracle that saves them. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from, because every story shared here becomes part of a family that reminds each other we are never truly alone. And if you believe kindness still matters in this world, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, healing, second chances, and the quiet miracles God places in our path every single day. May God bless you, protect your family, heal every hidden wound inside your heart, and fill your home with peace tonight.